Today we are here in Chicago, Illinois at the American Association of Law Libraries headquarters talking with Gretchen E. Van Dam, who is the circuit librarian for the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. And she is also the archivist for the Northern District Illinois Court Historical Association. Gretchen, as is sort of our custom in these interviews, could you tell us a little bit about your life, both when you were young and perhaps today?
Well, I grew up on the east side of Detroit. The youngest of five. My father was a school teacher, my mother a homemaker. Had a happy childhood. Spent my entire life through law school on the east side of Detroit, going to parochial schools for both elementary and high school, and then the University of Michigan for undergraduate school, and Wayne State University in Detroit for both law school and my library science degree.
So I know you hold 3 degrees. You just mentioned the law school degree and library degree. Do you want to talk a little bit about all the degrees?
Well, I went to the University of Michigan intending to be a business major. That was the goal, and higher math defeated me. So at that point, I became an English major. And when you graduate with an English degree in the mid-70s, there really wasn't a great career path for that. So I kind of bunched around a little bit with doing this and that, and I ended up at the University of Michigan in the purchasing department. And I moved up through the ranks there for the first few years and got to the point where I was doing some buying and negotiating some contracts. And at that point, law school seemed like a logical next step, and I was interested in the contracting aspect that I was working on in the purchasing department. So I started to apply to law schools and ended up going to Wayne State's law school because I could go as an evening student, which was important because I needed to work full-time while attending law school. When I was in law school, I clerked and worked at a large Detroit law firm, Dickinson Wright, Moon, Van Dusen, and Freeman. I think it's just Dickinson Wright right now.
That seems to be the current trend. They like to reduce it to just a couple or 3 names.
Exactly. It's shorter on a letterhead, I guess. My law librarian at Dickinson Wright was Melanie Dunshee, who's now at Duke University. And I was also on the law review when I was in law school, and probably am the only existent law review editor who loved site checking, just loved it. And Melanie at the time, because I was doing a lot of it on the sly at the law firm's library, Melanie said, you know, you really ought to consider law librarianship as a career path because you love the research, you love the investigative nature of what you're doing on the law review. And at the time I filed it away, graduated from law school, and immediately started library school. And was fortunate enough at that point in my first semester of library school to get an internship at the United Auto Workers Library at their Detroit headquarters, which is the national headquarters, Solidarity House, which is right on the Detroit River on East Jefferson Avenue in Detroit, and loved the library work that I was doing. And at that time, there was a job posting that the librarian at the UAW brought to my attention at the Detroit College of Law Library, which was an old YMCA law school located at the heart of downtown Detroit, right off Grand Circus Park. And I applied, and I think that took a lot of chutzpah in your first semester of library school, barely out of law school, to apply for the government documents librarian position at a law school library, and interviewed with Mario Cereza, who was the director of the Detroit College of Law Library, a Cuban emigre who kind of lucked into the job at DCL, and he took a liking to me and hired me in my second semester of library school to be the GovDocs librarian at the Detroit College of Law Library. And so, thanks to Melanie Dunshee, to the librarian at the UAW, and to Mario, I became a law librarian.
Well, it sounds like you've covered the territory as to how it was you were attracted into our field. I've never heard anyone exactly explain that they like doing site checks, and that was the trigger, but in your case...
Still love doing site checks, like nothing better than when the law clerks at the federal courts come to the library to do some blue booking.
Mm-hmm.
And the librarians say, you know who you should talk to is our circuit librarian. She loves blue booking. And I'm not sure whether or not that's because they hate blue booking and are happy to pass that reference transaction on to me, or they really do know that I do enjoy it.
I suspect what they hate is that they don't exactly know how to do the blue booking themselves, for sure, and they would love to find someone else that can help them hold their hand.
It's becoming increasingly difficult, even for me. It's just like, the blue book used to be about 50 pages when I was first dealing with it. Now I think they're up over 200. So now the best advice I can give somebody is cite it so somebody can find it.
You would think that as they lengthen it, they would be able to explain more extensively and more clearly what you're supposed to be doing, but I guess it seems to be going in the other direction.
I think that's right.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's with all the changes in the literature itself, if we can call digital sources literature. I guess they really are typed. They're just, you'd have to have more and more ways of dealing with all this stuff. The blue book has to be bigger as a result.
It's counterintuitive, though, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Does seem like that a little bit. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about some of the specific positions you've held over the years. Of course, you're the circuit librarian now here in Chicago and have been for a while. And you mentioned in your early days working at law school and other places. You want to talk a little bit about your career, and maybe some of the specific positions you've held, and maybe some of the things you feel you've accomplished.
Well, I did start out at DCL as the government documents librarian, a reference librarian. That was quite an experience, and I think a really good grounding. I tell my students today in library science class who worry about not having a JD, I said, but if you love the law, look for a GovDocs job, because that's what government documents are. And I learned a lot about legal research just opening those boxes and putting those SUDAC numbers on those documents and filing them and organizing them and doing the search for people. So I spent 3 years at DCL under the tutelage of Mario Cereza, Hilda Hanna, Lorraine Lorne, Amy Eaton were all the reference librarians there, and those women gave me a great grounding in how to do legal reference and how to do legal research.
Sounds like a very nice introduction to our profession.
It was great fun. It was great fun. Mario pretty much turned the library over to us and let us set policies, let us explore a lot of new ways of doing things, and we were all very cordial with one another. We were good friends. So it was a fun place to work, as well as a great training ground for learning about legal reference and legal bibliography. I think those women gave me the best foundation I could have had in how to find the law. And so it was fun, but I was looking for new challenges. Once I decided I was going to be a law librarian, I became very ambitious about well, okay, what's the best law librarian job out there? Now that I'm in academic law librarianship, well, I'm going to be the director of the Harvard Law Library. And so what do I need to do to become that?
Mm-hmm.
So I looked around and I thought, well, you know what? I need to move out to move up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's still true in academic law librarianship.
It's always a tough decision to make, but it's often what one has to do to, shall we say, move up in the ranks. You have
Exactly.
to move around a little bit and get other experiences.
Exactly, and get exposed to bigger and different collections
Mm-hmm.
of legal materials. And so I decided that I wanted to do that. And I was also very intrigued by emerging information technologies.
Mm-hmm.
And where was that happening? And in the early 90s, one of the places that was happening was Chicago Kent.
Okay.
They were, if you recall in those days with Ron Stout
No, I
and
remember.
Mickey
Yeah.
Vogus,
Yes.
they were groundbreaking.
We were all looking at them with a certain degree of envy, too.
Exactly.
They were able to be doing all these interesting sounding things.
Well, they had opened that new building
Mm-hmm.
that was high-tech as a building, and they had hardwired every seat
Mm-hmm.
in the library and in the classrooms. And they were looking at e-course books, e-textbooks. And Lexis was using Chicago Kent as their beta site for giving every student their own Lexis password.
Mm-hmm.
And moving away from those ubiquitous Ubics.
Oh, I remember those awful things with the little chiclet keys.
Exactly.
And you could only use them for a certain number of hours of the day. The afternoon, it was too busy, so we were kicked off on the academic plan.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And you had to sign up to get a time
Yeah.
to sit down to do your Lexis research. Well, they were moving away from Ubooks to PC-based
Uh-huh.
software. And remember, you had to load the software
Well,
on the personal computers. And Chicago Kent was a beta site for giving every student an individual Lexis password
Mm-hmm.
and setting them loose with that. And that was where I wanted to be. And at the time, a job as the head of reference came open. And so I applied for that and interviewed with Mickey and came over to Chicago and said, boy, this place is doing things.
Mm-hmm.
And they're breaking ground, and this is where I want to be. So I came to Chicago Kent to be the head of reference. And within a couple years, moved up to be the associate director.
Mm-hmm.
And we were digitizing UN materials, and we were doing some really interesting, cool things. And this was in the mid-90s, before I think any of this had ever really been considered by libraries about doing your own digital projects.
Mm-hmm.
And we had computer labs for students to do Lexis Westlaw training, and the librarians were doing that. We were in the classroom. And so it was pretty exciting. So I stayed at Chicago Kent through head of reference to the associate director,
Mm-hmm.
and then Mickey Vogus decided she was going to move to the faculty. And so I spent a year as the interim director
Mm-hmm.
at Chicago Kent, and at the same time, the circuit librarian position came open as I was considering staying at Chicago Kent
Mm-hmm.
to be the director. And I had never considered leaving academic law librarianship, but this opportunity came open to move to the federal courts. And the director of the Legal Research and Writing Program at the time, Molly Lean, said to me, and she had been a former clerk of court for Judge Powell
Mm-hmm.
at the Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. She said, boy, you know, it would be a great experience. And I think you would love working with federal judges. They're challenging and they do things that matter, and the work that you would do would make a difference. And it was an opportunity to run a multi-library system. And I thought, you know, that might be an interesting detour.
Mm-hmm.
out of academic law librarianship.
detour,
A
huh?
detour.
A detour.
I really viewed it as a detour. It's just a
Uh-huh.
little side track for 2, 3, 4 years at the most.
Mhm.
That I would go to the federal courts and beef up my resume a little bit and then come back to academic law librarianship. Well, 13 years later, I'm still in the federal court library system.
Beefing up your resume all
Beefing up my
over, huh?
resume, exactly. Because it was so wonderful
Mhm.
and challenging. And I really did feel that we were contributing to work that made a difference.
Uh-huh.
And so I never went back to academic law
Yeah,
librarianship.
rumor does have it that the courts make major decisions from time to time, and
Yeah.
that makes quite a difference for
Exactly.
everybody. Yeah.
And I love working with federal judges.
Mhm. Well, I've noticed in my own background investigation that you have a history of still with a finger or two in academic life, and that you teach courses from time to time. Are you still doing some of that?
I am, and love that. One of the things that was the best part of going to Chicago Kent was the opportunity to have your own class of advanced legal research
Mhm.
and to be an adjunct instructor at the law school. And I love that so much. I didn't want to give it up when I moved to the federal court library. And so I taught for a year after I left, still at Chicago Kent. And then the opportunity came to teach for a year at Loyola's
Uh-huh.
law school. And then to teach for 2 or 3 years as a legal writing instructor at John Marshall's
Mhm.
law school. So I've almost made the full circuit
Yeah, it looked like
Of
you've been around
Chicago.
the circuit a bit here, and there are a number of schools in town.
at Chicago
Yeah.
Law Libraries. And then the opportunity came to teach in the graduate library program
Uh-huh.
at Dominican University.
Uh-huh.
And I settled in that because that seemed to really resonate. The ability to train new law librarians
Mhm.
in legal research in the profession.
Mhm.
Dominican had 2 classes. One that was a traditional legal research class that was taught very similarly to the way you would teach legal research to law students.
Mhm.
But they also had a legal librarianship class in which you were able to introduce people to the profession
Mhm.
and what it meant to be a law librarian. And so the opportunity to do both of that was irresistible,
Mhm.
to mold young law librarians. So I've enjoyed that immensely. That's been great fun.
Well, you know, quite a few of our colleagues over the years have come out of Dominican, or I guess it was the predecessor library school, Rosary.
Rosary College,
I
yeah.
remember many colleagues who had come up that way and had come into our field. So maybe they've been educating their library students about law librarianship for a while. I don't know, but
They have actually. I think they're have been pretty much at the forefront in having a specialized class. It's always taught by an adjunct, and I know that occasionally they have trouble finding people because when you commit to teaching, it's a huge commitment of time and energy if you're going to do it right.
yes.
And it's difficult when our jobs are so challenging these days to also commit to devoting that time to teaching an extra class of teaching. But it's extraordinarily rewarding.
I remember when I was first appointed director at American University in Washington, the question came up, well, what would I teach? Not would I teach, but what would I teach? Because I was a faculty member, and the sense was, well, everybody on the faculty teaches. And I wasn't, at that point, enamored at the idea of, you know, I had a full-time day job, I figured, and teaching would be in addition. But I did take on courses and found that added a dimension to my life that I really enjoyed. I mean, it gave me contact with students, especially as we grew. And I was, as director, probably a little more remote because I had layers of excellent people between me and the students that needed help most of the time. So it was a wonderful thing, and I can appreciate your comments that it is an opportunity that is really very special, I think.
I come from a family of educators. Almost everyone in my family are school teachers, from elementary through university professors. And as the youngest, I always said I'm going to be anything but a school teacher because they were all born school teachers. So as well, you know, school teachers are always teaching.
Well, at least I have a sister who is, and she's every night working on papers and stuff.
Exactly, but they're always teaching, even in just day-to-day living.
Well,
it rides in the car can become classrooms. And so at the time I had always said I'm never going to be that person. And when I got the job at Chicago Ken and got a class of my own, I remember my father had great glee in saying, "See, we knew we'd get you one way or the other." And the fact is that when you get in a classroom and you see those faces, and there can only has to be one or two in a sea of faces that just get it when you're trying to communicate a concept. And that one face will make the whole semester worthwhile. That one student that comes afterwards and said, "You know, I think this was the best class I took in law school." You say, "Well then, you know what? I can go home happy tonight because I've reached somebody." And that makes it all worthwhile.
Yeah, the old joke in the faculty was that we didn't really need to get paid to teach because that was so much fun. So we did that for free. Now when it came to exams, on the other hand, that's when we earned the money.
Well, there you go. It's the grading. It was when you've got those papers that you're sitting there and you think, I am never doing this again. I'm going to take a semester off. And then the call comes and says, you know, would you take on a section of...
You turn in your grades and forget how that work was.
It's exactly right.
Yeah.
I guess it's a little bit like childbirth.
Oh, is that how it works?
Yeah, you turn the grades in and you forget all the agony that led up to it. And you're ready to go again when the call comes. But
and then they grow into teenagers.
Well,
you're back
there you
in
go.
another form of
There you
agony
go. There you go. But no, it's I don't know, for natural born teachers, and I think a lot of librarians are, because we wouldn't be in librarianship if we didn't want to be educators. That classroom experience is second to none.
Well, I always found it a very interesting part of my week, doing the classes. And then as we got closer to the end, the students would come in for, help and maybe to see if they could curry favor, whatever they were there for. And I always enjoyed those visits. And, one time I was teaching class, and in those days the student bar had keggers at the law school, beer kegs. And I didn't feel I should be drinking beer during class, so I didn't go down to the student lounge. There'd been some discussion by some of the students, if they brought something back, what would happen for them. I thought.
Sure.
And I said, no, I don't, as long as you're sober, I don't care, as long as you're paying attention. If you're sitting there sipping a glass of beer, so be it. Well, they didn't want to drink alone, so they were all of us with our beer because they brought me back one, and I actually did drink it during that second hour.
It was probably the best class you ever taught.
It was a lot of fun. It really it was one of those moments you do remember from the teaching that are sort of unusual, but a lot of fun to remember.
Well, and if you recall in our early days, we probably could have all used a keg of beer teaching shepherds in print.
Maybe so. Maybe so. In fact, maybe that would be the best way to learn about what those were all about.
Maybe we'd all understand it if we had had a few beers beforehand.
Yeah, I think they used to look like railroad timetables or stock market tables or something.
Yeah.
Now you have, besides teaching and being the circuit librarian and other librarians' positions over the years, you've done a fair amount for the profession. You've been president of CALL, the Chicago chapter. You've been involved in the Michigan Council of Federal Depository Libraries, I guess going back to your days when you were working in government documents. And later you've been with the Federal Library and Information Center Committee. Could you talk a little bit about perhaps some of your professional involvements, perhaps these things or some things I have not mentioned?
Well, I think, and I was mentored into the notion that association work was a great way to learn about your profession, to enhance your skill sets, but also to, meet new people with new ideas. I really love the concept of being able to go into a workplace and having directors and managers who will say to a newer person in the field, well, if you can think of a better way to do it, bring it to the table. And that's not always the case for a lot of our colleagues who came to the field at the same time I did, who were kind of told, well, that's the way we've always done it, and that's the way we're going to do it. And thanks for your crazy suggestion, but, it's a crazy suggestion.
Yeah.
Going to associations, working with association meetings, going to the meetings, learning and reaching out to new people was always a way for me to say, well, you know what, there's a different way to do this. And I think it's a better way to do it. And having the ability, particularly at Chicago Kent, to have a director who would say, well, if you can come up with a better way, then have at it. And so I took that to heart. And so I loved association meetings. I loved meeting people from different parts of the country. I loved taking ideas from different types of libraries, public libraries, special libraries, law firm libraries, who were doing things that I thought, well, we could do it that way, and that would be better than the way we're doing it. We ought to look at and really examine the ways we're doing things and say, hey, why not? So I started in association work with that in mind. It was also a good way to expose yourself to people who were the movers and shakers in our profession. And for a person who was ambitious in their career, I saw that as a way to come to the attention of people who were in a position to make things happen for you. And I stayed because it was challenging, exciting work in which you felt that you were contributing to your profession. So I might have started out in association work with a kind of a selfish viewpoint towards career stepping stones, but I stayed because I saw what good work local and national library associations do, both for the people in the profession, but also for the people and the community that these professions serve.
Well, you've done a fair amount, as I already mentioned and you've talked about, but you've been on programs. I mean, you've contributed back through your association work as well, not just, getting to know the so-called makers and shakers of whatever, but you're one of us, that you basically give back in a very positive way.
Well, I think some of my closest friends would, with tongue-in-cheek, would say, well, it's because Gretchen likes to be the boss of things. So that gives you the opportunity, when you want to change something, well, get involved, get appointed to be the chair of a committee, and you can affect some changes in the directions that you think are important and that you want to be a part of.
Well, that sort of leads me into the next item I wanted to talk about in our conversation, and that is, you've been active in the profession for quite a few years now. I won't maybe mention how many because
Thank you.
Yes. And it's been an era of tremendous change. I mean, you talk about what you and Mickey Bogus and the others at Chicago Kent were doing 20 or so years ago, and how forward-thinking it seemed at the time, and yet now I suppose how routine some of that would be, or maybe even somewhat archaic by today's standards. Been a tremendous amount of change in the field. You've been head of a major circuit court library during much of that time. Would you care to talk a little bit about perhaps some of those changes that you have seen, and perhaps more importantly, you know, if you dare want to take this risk, put your thinking cap on what might be coming next, and want to talk about that as well.
Well, it has been interesting times, challenging times, stressful times, to tell you the truth. I always tell my legal research students, you're in an interesting time for legal research. You have to master tools that were developed in the 19th century, tools that were developed in the 20th century, tools that were developed in the 21st century. You have to stand astride 3 centuries of legal research tools and be masters and experts at all of them. And I think that unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to view it, has been the challenge for law librarians over the past 30 years of what it is that we do. We are still using and have to be experts at legal research tools that were developed and created in the 19th century.
Right.
And we have to be able to predict and have the skill sets ready to go for legal research tools that haven't yet been developed, that are going to show up and become commonplace within the next 18 months. How do you do that? What do you do when it comes to your own personal and professional development that keeps you and ready to master that? And it's difficult. I'm very sympathetic to those members of our field who became experts at running libraries that don't have relevance anymore to a user group that is not ready to come down to a library, pull a book off a shelf, and work through an index to find information, that they're used to having that on their cell phone. And we've got professionals perhaps who say, but my expertise is in ensuring that information in print is available on that shelf, where it's supposed to be, when it's supposed to be there, and that I know exactly how to use it. I'm an expert at that. And now you're telling me that that's not relevant
A wonderful
anymore.
role that was more the era of the 1950s through maybe the 70s, before Lexis and Westlaw started to come along, and then everything else that would fit then. But today, you're right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we've asked these people to completely retool themselves. And we've, at the same time, unfortunately, said to them, what you're great at, we don't value anymore. And I think that's wrong.
Yeah.
I think we have to say it's of great value. It's just not the way the majority of our users are going to access information. But it's still of value. And what you do is still of value. However, you're going to have to expand your skill sets and learn new things. Now, for many people in our field, the reason they're in our field is because they're super intelligent, they're super adaptable, they're ready, willing, and able to do that. And so I think, fortunately, you know, we've got a workforce, a cadre of professional law librarians who's like, no problem, we're ready to go. You know, whatever it is, you give it to me and I'll learn it. And so that's great, and we're keeping up with our users in that respect. But how do you keep up with the 8th grader that's out there who is imagining things, you know, that we can only hope will come to pass? How do you keep a 60-year-old law librarian ready for that 8th grader who's going to be in our libraries in less than 10 years? So that, I think, is the challenge. And at the same time, we're seeing the people who are in charge of our budgets saying, you have to pick one or the other.
Yeah.
We can no longer fund everything. We can't fund the 19th century tool as well as the 21st century tool. You have to pick one to be funded. And increasingly, they're saying the 19th century tool, the print, is a luxury. That is not the mechanism by which we can access information and pay and support paying for that. So we're going to go with the 21st century tool. We're going to fund the online tool. We're not going to fund physical items on shelves in physical spaces. And that's a legitimate choice on their part. But it is a revolution in our field. And it's stressful because I've heard librarians talk about their collections like gardens. They've taken years to develop these collections.
Well, I remember many of the most highly regarded colleagues, and especially in my earlier days, it was the quality of the collections that they had built for their places.
And they took years to build those collections.
Yes.
And nurture them and weed them and grow them such that, you know, you had a fully developed, beautiful collection that people don't want anymore. And that's stressful.
Yeah.
It's hard to look at these edifices of information and knowledge and say, well, we don't use that anymore. No one goes in there anymore, which is what's happening in our federal court libraries. Law clerks are not physically coming in to the space to use the collection, which is not to say they're not using library services.
That's right.
They are. But we just have to think of it differently. We have to think of our libraries as the services and the people who provide those services. And that sometimes the information we find for them is found through print materials. Sometimes it's found online, it's found in a fee-based database, it's found on Google Scholar, it's found on the internet in Wikipedia. You know, it's a collection of information rather than a collection of books on shelves. But it's been stressful for many of our colleagues to say, but we have this wonderful collection. And to discard it, to see it go into the dumpster, is painful.
Yeah, it's always been hard to see something that looks like it ought to have value thrown out. And for so long, those books were the value. I mean, they were all you had, all we had. And now times have changed. I notice this in my own work. You know, I've been retired for a little over 10 years now, and I'm working out of my house. I'm not sitting around the library building with all the resources that one takes for granted there. And yet I do research, and I find that the stuff I can find through my computer is just absolutely fascinating and empowering. I want to read information about, you know, things that are going on. I often can find it and readily, and I consider it such a convenience to be able to do that. But I'm sure other people are different minds and different views on all of that as well.
Well, I think what you're experiencing is what our end users have experienced. They no longer feel they need an intermediary between them and the information, which is kind of what a librarian served as in some respects. It was a filter. Now, I have a judge who says, I absolutely still and welcome the filter, because I don't want to take a sip of water out of a fire hose,
Yeah.
which is what I feel I'm trying to do when I go online, because the information is overwhelming,
Yes.
because there's so much I retrieve.
Mhm.
I need someone in between to filter that and tell me what's good information, what's valuable information, and specifically what is exactly the information I need for the project I'm working on, so that I'm not spending hours filtering through that. Now, as an end user myself, when I'm working on a project, I need that filter. When I'm just exploring, the serendipity of the internet
Mhm.
is fun. It's
Mhm.
fun to just go traipsing through the internet. But as you know, when you look up 3 hours later and wonder where did the time go, I can't believe I spent all this time just staring at the screen,
And,
you know,
and what do you have to show for it?
clicking
too?
from one thing to another. That's in the context of what our workplace users need.
Mhm.
That's not what they need. They need someone to say, judge, professor, partner, associate, turn it over to me. I'll get the response back to you within 10 or 15 minutes.
Mhm.
And then you take that information and run with it. You don't need, in the context of what we're doing right now, to be lost on the internet for a couple of hours.
Sounds like you have just put your finger on what the good reference librarian of the 21st century is all about.
I think that's true. I
Mhm.
think that we should not be afraid of what the future holds for a really good reference librarian.
Mhm.
In that you are a detective. That's
Mhm.
always been the fun part, and what makes a great reference librarian is someone who cannot let go of the query and says, I'm going to find that exact correct piece of information regardless of where it takes me, and I won't let go of this reference transaction until I do. And they do it for the end user,
Mhm.
and that's what the end user needs.
Yeah.
So I think there's a great role for people who are experts at accessing and finding information,
Mhm.
regardless of the platform or the format the information may be found via.
You know, it's really, that's been the role, as I've always envisioned it, of librarians all throughout this. I mean, at one point, it was too many books, and then we had to figure out how to organize them and catalog them so people could actually find what they needed in those books. Now we're doing the same thing, but it's of this huge new array of resources that we collectively call the internet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I don't think we should be frightened by that.
Mm.
It is stressful because
Mhm.
we do have to retool.
Yeah.
Many of us, particularly those of us who have got some tenure in the field, you know, a new cell phone in front of us is like, oh my gosh, where's the manual?
Mhm.
And you know, that's challenging for us. But I think we ought to embrace that challenge
Mhm.
and say, you know what? In the same way we learned how to use print shepherds, we can learn how to use Google Scholar.
Sure.
And you know, we're the best people available for that task.
It must make the working in the field a lot more interesting to be moving with the times and learning about all these new opportunities that are now becoming available.
Well, it's a constant learning
Uh-huh.
opportunity. And I hope that we all use the word opportunity instead of constant learning burden.
Mhm.
But it does require that librarians today always put themselves in the continuing education mode.
I think perhaps on that, we're sort of nearing the end of our time together in our conversation. But is there anything, Gretchen, that we've not talked about that you would like to mention before we conclude?
I don't think so. I hope that if there are people who are considering entering the profession, who are brand new to our profession, who watch this, are excited
Mhm.
by what's happening in law librarianship rather than fearful of what's happening in librarianship in general. I think our challenges are challenges felt in many fields, not just in law librarianship. And I think that it's something that one can, if you embrace it and view it as a challenge and an opportunity, rather than be afraid of it and shy away from it, you'll find that the field has as many wonderful things to happen to you as a young law librarian as has happened to those of us who've been in it for many years when we first entered it. And there's many, many, many years of great research and reference yet ahead of them.
Well, I think on that particular note, I should thank you, Gretchen Van Dam, for talking with me today, having a conversation. Not only thank you on my behalf, but that of our colleagues Frank Odek, Michelle Wu, and Dick Spinelli, with whom I have the honor of working to put together this oral history of law librarianship for the Spinelli's law library reference shelf section of Hein Online. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.